Welcome to Round Hill Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about when we talk about faith. Hey, Ed.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. You know, one of those moments where you almost like trip over yourself?
I do.
I almost rewrote our intro just now. I was like, redefine what we talk about when we talk about grace. I almost said grace, which I think is funny.
That'd be great.
It's, we do that too.
Of course.
We'll do some of that too. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back in. We're so glad to have you here. It is week 10 on our 52-week journey. Friendly reminder that you can grab your copy of your guidebook and journal on Amazon today. They look like this for our video viewers. Hi. There you go. And so here we go. We're in the land of Matthew, which we've been in for a little bit. And here we go. From the Common English Bible. Is that what CEB stands for?
Common English Bible.
There we go. All right. So it's Matthew 5, 38 through 48. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you must not oppose those who want to hurt you. If people slap you on your right cheek, you must turn the left cheek to them as well. When they wish to haul you to court and take your shirt, let them have your coat too. When they force you to go 1 mile, go with them too. Give to those who ask and don't refuse those who wish to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you so that you will be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. He makes the sun rise on both the evil and the good and sends rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love only those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, just as your heavenly Father is complete in showing love to everyone, so also you must be complete. Do I have to? Is the first question that comes to mind.
It's quite a stretch, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, I'm tripping over myself quite a little bit today. I was enjoying the almost when they wish to haul you to court and take your shirt. I almost read that wrong. So that was a funny moment in my head. I noticed this pattern of sort of rhetoric he has with you have heard that it was said. Each sort of section is started with, you have heard that it was said.
Yep.
So who was saying it? If this is something that's like in the ether of the culture.
Right. Yeah.
What was going on?
Who's he responding to? By the way, you'd mentioned something early on that we're in the land of Matthew.
The land of Matthew.
Yeah, which is a good way to describe it. And one of the reasons why in choosing these 52 texts, I thought it might be interesting to choose at least a few from Matthew, is that he feels to me like he has a very programmatic way of describing how Jesus launches his ministry.
Okay.
And there seems to be a plan, in the background. And I think part of that plan is that he's going to arrive at a time where he's going to reveal his philosophies, his theology, his views of life and humanity and God. And he does that as part of a long sermon that's now known as the Sermon on the Mount, right? So he's gathered his disciples. There's a crowd that's present. And this really represents for a lot of people the core of his teaching.
Okay.
So part of what he's doing here, he's responding to two things. He's got a crowd. He's got an audience, right? So he wants to say something to them that's going to be decisive for the way they're going to unfold their own lives and discipleship, their ministry. But he is responding to some texts that were formed a long time before he was around.
Okay.
And so there's a passage in the book of Leviticus. There are a couple of passages, I think, that are interesting and maybe relevant here. And the first one is in chapter 24, the book of Leviticus. It begins at the 19th verse. And it says, anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. One who kills an animal shall make restitution for it, but one who kills a human being shall be put to death. So there's kind of a radical one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
That's what you did. Now this is what's going to happen to you,
Right.
to equalize the territory. It's interesting because a little earlier than that, also in the book of Leviticus, there's a fascinating passage where it says, "You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people," and here's the real key phrase, "but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Mm-hmm. So that little phrase at the end, "you shall love your neighbor as yourself," is one that Jesus will pick up right? Several times as being like the core of the great commandment. So when he says, "You have heard it said," that's what he's referring to. Mm-hmm. That there's something in the legal traditions of his people, the spiritual teachings of his people that have been around for many hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. He's then going to take that, I think, and want to push it in a couple of new directions. Mm-hmm. And as we were talking a little bit earlier, the interesting thing about that is that Matthew, I think, likes to see Jesus as the new Moses.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Moses was such a great leader for the people of Israel. And Matthew's going to say, here's essentially a new kind of Moses, mm-hmm. or a new Moses. But the new Moses is going to say things that are a little different than the original Moses.
Yeah.
And so in Jesus' mind anyway, these teachings are a little fluid, quite fluid,
yeah.
right? And he uses that phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you," several times, mm-hmm. to kind of distinguish the uniqueness of his message. So that's a little bit of the background to what's happening.
2 questions.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so first, do we know who the writer of Leviticus was?
I think we have a good idea. The Leviticus is one of the first 5 books of the Bible. It's known as the Torah. Uh-huh. And so there are half a dozen different writers who are responsible, and we have a pretty good sense of it. They're actually known by alphabetical letters.
Oh, really?
J, E, D, P, and then there's maybe some possibility that there's an R, which stands for a redactor, somebody who went in and cleaned some things up or changed some things. And there's the redactor's presence all over the place in the Bible. Wow. And we often don't know who those people were.
So interesting.
So we do have a sense of who, wrote some of that. But the interesting thing is that a lot of these texts are like quilts. And you get pieces that are inserted, so you'll have one writer writing for a couple of chapters, then all of a sudden there's an insertion, and then there's somebody else. So,
oh my goodness.
Not sure about the specific background for this text in Leviticus, but we have a sense that there's one of the major writers.
Okay. And so I'm really fascinated by the idea that, within the Bible, there's such blatant, it's the best word I can think of, blatant contradictions within itself.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And I'm thinking about that human tendency to read and connect to the things we want to connect to and
right.
be like, oh, well, and I feel like Leviticus maybe has a number of things like this that Jesus is like, no, that's not how we're doing things in the heaven we're creating here. And I think that's really fascinating and shows it kind of makes me think of AI and the idea of a tool. It can be a tool for good or ill.
Uh-huh.
Yep. In this way that also these texts can be used to rationalize good behavior or not so good behavior.
Right. Well, good point. And so the other thing that strikes me about this is that people have, I think a lot of times there's this, we were trying to figure out how to make these texts make sense to us.
Sure.
Right. First of all, they're very old. They're ancient texts. They're coming out of a culture that's so foreign to us in so many different ways. And so to really put our mindset into a mindset, that's long gone, but thrived a long time ago. That's quite a feat.
Yeah.
There are some people who have wanted to say, especially on the Christian side of things, well, here's an example of how Judaism is inferior to Christianity, right? Jesus is kind of establishing a new benchmark for how things should be done. And so see, he's already distancing himself. But that wouldn't be accurate because, first of all, he remains a Jew. But the other part of it is that there are other sections of his text where he talks about the law is going to be fulfilled in all of its completeness. So what is he getting at there? I mean, that's the open-ended question, right? And people of Jewish faith are always wrestling with these texts, just like we are wrestling with them. And but again, we have a number of moves that we make to try to make things simpler than they ought to be. And I'm just going to pull in a quote from somebody who died recently, David Lynch, who was quite an amazing filmmaker and baffling to almost everybody who knew him and watched his films. But people used to say to him, I can't make sense out of your movies. They just don't fit the normal template, He said, life doesn't make sense. Why would you expect my movies to make sense? So I think that when we look at all of these rich texts from the Bible, the one thing to do rather than to make one seem superior than the other is to put them all in conversation with each other and say, well, why do we think people originally thought that or said that? Why do we think in some cases there was a change made? You can see in some of the short prophetic books in the Old Testament, like Micah and Joel, that again, there is somebody who came in at the very end and sort of tidied things up with a few verses at the end that maybe put a much brighter message on a pretty difficult book. And I think it's that human tendency to say, how can we make this acceptable, usable, right? Because maybe it feels uniformly too harsh or something.
Yeah.
So Jesus is taking a look at some texts, and he wants us to consider a different kind of interpretation.
Right.
And so that's what we're left with this story.
It's so interesting because I think what you were saying, we want to simplify. I think there's this human tendency that we want things to be in these bite-sized, easy digestible sort of sound bites. But in this sort of almost binary black and white of like good, bad.
Right.
And I think in doing so, we're missing the entire spectrum of color.
Exactly.
Which also...
Great image. Yep.
Because I was thinking, I think we were talking earlier about the gray area, and I'm going to choose to reframe that now. As a spectrum of color, I was thinking about this. That this is like, instead of it being gray, which is like murky and unknown, yes, it's unknown, but what if that gray area is actually just all the colors together, and you can see different expressions of whatever it is you're looking into. And especially with these texts, it's like there's so much there, and like this is contradicting this, and this is contradicting this, and there's all this color and depth and richness versus like gray, murky swamp.
Yep.
Yep. And I think that can maybe be helpful in like, as you're kind of fighting the good fight of like trying to figure out where it lands and where you're feeling led and what is supporting your faith in what you're reading. So
you're saying that rather than see that as gray, there's all the colors in a sense are in there somewhere.
As my toddler would say, rainbow colors.
There you go. Right? Well, here's the thing. I worked with an Irish artist for a while who said that when he was a young man, he was learning, there was an artist he worked with who had this big, I don't know what to describe it, as like bowl or something in the middle of his studio. And it was all the paint that had been used like during the day. And he would just sort of scrape it all in there. That's the paint that a lot of people some artists might throw that stuff out.
Sure.
Right. And he said, no. To your point, it contains all the colors in there. It looks kind of murky, know, it looks a little like grayishy, soupy. But why isn't it just as valuable, right, as some kind of brilliant turquoise or whatever it might be? So I think the Bible gives us everything. It gives us everything of life. It gives us all of our, in some ways it gives us all of the best of who we are, and it gives us sometimes the worst of who we are. You take a look at how characters act and behave, and the things they ascribe to God, right? The feelings and behaviors they ascribe to God. It's all there. They haven't edited anything out. Wow. And that means that it really, truly is a profoundly human book. And so then you get, a passage like the one we got today, which seems to help us to aspire to something that's impossible, actually.
Yeah.
But it can also make us, it can reflect other emotions and beliefs and views that are contradictory to this.
Can I push that even further?
Sure.
Since I know it's not really connected to our text, but this is but something I've been thinking about, this idea that you said this profoundly human book.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like sometimes the Bible gets elevated to such a level as growing up as a child. I always felt like, oh, God wrote this book.
Mm-hmm.
Like God maybe through somebody, but he was like, God's over in the corner being like, and I'm sure there's elements of that, but it also feels like there's a lot of human nonsense, for lack of a better word, because I have tons of nonsense, right? Like there's a lot of human ick in it, which makes it real,
right?
In a way, right?
And I think that's why listening to writers over the years like William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, they come to mind, but there's so many other examples of people who have said their inspiration was drawn almost entirely from the Bible. Not because they were, picking on a particular story and trying to rehash it, but because they saw in the humanity of the characters the foundation for the most amazing stories. And so they thought, well, if the Bible, in its creation over the years by so many different writers and editors, has bequeathed to us this grand scope of imagination about our struggle to be human, right? And it's interesting how this passage ends with this. Therefore, just as your heavenly Father is complete in showing love to everyone, so also you must be complete.
Yeah, I want to talk about that.
Very interesting word to use, complete, because sometimes it's translated differently. But it's this vision of the hope of completeness, but then everything we do to get in the way of that.
Yeah.
Right?
We're really good at it.
All the way through. And the Bible, the biblical writers do not save us from those depictions, because as we're reading them, we can say, oh, wow, look at the quest for power in that person. You know what? I'm sad to say I kind of feel that, right? Or I think that's the story of my life, or whatever it is. And that's why we've been able to identify with it. And you have the collection of Psalms, 150 songs or poems, right? Kind of in the geographical heart of the Bible. Some of those Psalms are so bloodthirsty or forlorn, or they're full of lamentation. On the other hand, they can bring us to the exalted heights of praise and whatever. It's everything.
So, yeah.
And I always think it's so funny, when I've gone to a retreat in a monastery, you get monks, waking up at 3 a.m. to go out into the sanctuary for one of their many services during the day. And they're sort of, chanting in this monotone, Lord, please bring vengeance to my enemies. And please, and you're thinking, there's a lot of emotion in there. But then, 3 verses later, it'll say, I exalt your holy name and worship you with, so it's all of it. And they choose not to edit any of it out.
Sure.
Which I think is wonderful.
Well, and you were just saying there's some heavy-handed editing happening, but then looking at what is left.
Yeah. I think about how the Gospel of Mark ends. It ends basically with the Greek. In the Greek, it ends with the word for, F-O-R. It's like somebody was writing, and then got called away in the middle of the sentence, and that was that.
Wow.
So another ending was added. But then another ending was added. So which of the endings are you going to trust, read? Maybe all of them? Maybe you have questions about all of, who knows? It puts a lot back on us, right? We're the ones who are being engaged. And that, I think, is the driver here. It's meant to engage us. If we feel frustrated and we feel like, closing it and slamming it down and putting it away in a cupboard somewhere, well, then it's done its job. It's gotten to us. It's definitely touched some part of us. And I think that's what it's meant to do. It's not going to, this passage, which has this exalted idea that I say to you that you must not oppose those who want to hurt you. Now, that passage was probably written, I'm going to say about 40 years after Rome devastated Jerusalem.
Okay.
Right. Squelched a rebellion that had been in place. This would have been around the year 60. So this gospel was written with the memory, still fresh, somewhat fresh, of what Romans did to Jews in this region of the world to suppress the rebellion. People would have remembered that there was a time when Rome used to line the roads with crosses with crucified bodies on them, right? So, and excuse me, I say to you that you must not oppose those who want to hurt you. It actually gives me chills reading it because it is so out of the, I think, natural mental framework that we have about how you're going to fight for your kith and kin, if somebody hurts your family, somebody hurts you.
Of course.
It's, and yet people live according to this. I've known people who have had the most horrendous things happen to their families through acts of violence and have chosen not to respond in kind. And you think, okay, so we have the capacity. That's what Jesus is tapping here. He's tapping a capacity in us. And of course, the whole civil rights movement in some ways was based on this passage.
Yeah.
Right.
When I hear stories like that, I think to myself, those people are made of better stuff than I am. Right? That's how I feel. I'm like, that is a different, just wow. That just feels like such an evolution of a human.
Yeah.
Is how that feels to me.
Yeah, I like that phrase, is that this is what we're intended to evolve towards.
Yeah.
That's our true destiny. And we live in a world that wants us to sell out on that, right? And give in to, any kind of, quick reactive response to violence. It's a world that wants to see us as consumers rather than forgivers. That's so many different ways of looking at this, but this is a text that wants us to be our best angels.
Yeah. What were you saying about Gandhi before?
Yeah. So when Mahatma Gandhi had moved to London, I believe it was, I think that's where he studied to receive his law degree. Someone handed him a copy of maybe it been of the Bible, or it may have just been of the New Testament, but he read these sections and he was so touched by them that these actually became the basis for his philosophy of nonviolence. And he wedded to that his understandings of Indian philosophy and blended this together. And of course, it was Martin Luther King Jr. who just couldn't get enough of Gandhi, read everything he could, and he met people who had met Gandhi. And so had his own interactions as well. And so it was King who then, you trace this line, right? It's amazing because it really starts in that passage from Leviticus, you should love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
And then it just keeps going through Jesus, through the centuries. Here's a young law student from India in London, and he reads this and think about the person who put that in his hands, what he was doing. History does not tell us who that is, I don't think. But Martin Luther King Jr. picks it up, and here we are today, still wrestling with what it means to fulfill this particular commandment. I say commandment deliberately because I think this is how Jesus is expressing this. It's not like, if you think about it.
Right.
If you get around to it.
Right.
No, this is how life is supposed to be.
Right.
And anything else that is not of this is a contradiction to it and is an obstacle to what God imagines for the world.
You know what would be a really fun exercise? If Jesus was the new Moses, to sit down as a group and write, what if Jesus had 10 commandments? What would Jesus' 10 commandments be?
Great. I think that's a great thought. And it may be that they're even kind of that they're embedded here, right?
Yeah.
That every time he's saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you, right?
Yeah.
And then I think that's a wonderful idea.
That could be fun.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah. Because this idea of the contradiction and this idea of like, if we're, I wanted to go back because I think you were talking about how what the Bible is for us. And I was thinking about the fact that sometimes it feels like when you sit down to read a Bible, you sort of want to receive it. It's sort of almost passive. And I mean that in a positive way, that you're sitting and you're learning, right?
Yep.
You're sitting at the feet of a teacher and you're learning. But I think it's almost, the way you're explaining it today almost makes it feel like it needs to be a dialogue rather than a monologue.
Thank you.
I listen. I get there eventually.
Madeline L'Engle, who wrote so many wonderful, right? I mean, come on. She was amazing.
Amazing.
She said something once that really struck home with me and also explained to me why I really could not read the Bible for a very long time. Because I think I read it as like, I'm supposed to be getting something from this, right? But I'm not getting it. So she said she was always very thankful that the adults in her household really treated the Bible as one other storybook. So you had Moby Dick and The Sun Also Rises and the Bible. And so all, in her view, growing up as a young girl, all great stories. So when you treat it first as a story, you're thinking, wow, this is so amazing. Right. These characters are so amazing. And sometimes amazing things happen to them and they do amazing things, right? And then they also do awful things. But it's a story. And we're better, I think we're, fine-tuned to story reception, right? And we're trying, the effort to make the Bible something other than a story is never ending, So we try to fix it in people's minds as this, as a perfect book, or, that not a word of it can be changed, and on and on and on it goes. And all of that undermines the story, and apparently God loves stories and speaks through stories. That would be when people ask me, well, do you think the Bible is inspired, which is usually a setup question. It's got a right or a wrong answer. My answer is that this shows that God loves stories, and God loves our stories. And so then, what is God trying to make happen through our stories? And I loved something that our guest preacher said as part of our online service recently, the Reverend Ann Kaufman. She said, to be thoughtful about what God might be doing through your spiritual gifts. And one of the things that you can do in the Bible is when you come upon a character, whether Jesus or someone else, to say, what does God seem to be trying to do here, through this person's life, through this particular story? What's blocking it? What's helping it? And that makes the story more interesting, because then it is like, I'm reading a novel now, and book of fiction, it's a mystery, and I'm totally caught up in the life of the main character. I'm done. I'm just all in.
I love it.
Right? It's a great feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that's the feeling that I want to have when I'm reading the Bible too. I'd love for other people to have that, like, wow, what is going to happen next
Real
here?
page turner.
Right?
Yeah.
And it is a real page turner. If we could say, this is one of the most amazing collection of stories you're ever going to read, seems to be, the way Christian tradition views it, seems to be the way that God has chosen to communicate some very essential information.
Right.
Right. But that takes a certain kind of approach to it.
So we know Jesus taught through parables. This is like established as a thing. So is it taking it too far? And the answer can be yes. Is it taking it too far to say that maybe the Bible is just like one big parable? I'm going to mumble that because I feel really awkward saying that out loud. But is it like that kind? Is that the kind of idea?
I think so.
Of like, we're teaching through storytelling. We all know stories are great teachers. That's how we learn. It's a great way to learn.
Yep. And don't you feel like when it's a parable, you've really got to suss it out.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to take a team. It might not be an individual, right?
Yeah.
I love the image of the whole Bible being a parable. There was I've always loved this one quotation from British poet Auden, W.H. Auden. He said, "You cannot tell people what to do. You can only give them parables." Mm-hmm. And because the experience of telling somebody what to do is like, you can't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
But if you give someone a parable, they're like, what does that mean? It sort of works its way into our brain.
Yeah.
And so if the whole Bible is a parable and that it's just wants us to come into the water, I think that's a phenomenal image. So go for it.
We'll dive in, everybody.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great conversation, and thank you so much. And we are so glad for you to be joining us. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.